Now that we've learned a bit about the components that are shared by all cells, let's look specifically at the components or organelles that are found in the eukaryotic cell, starting with the nucleus. So eukaryotic cells have their internal volume divided up into smaller compartments, which we call organelles. One of the most obvious and most distinctive for eukaryotic cells is that of their nucleus. This is the organelle that contains their DNA. However, the nucleus isn't the only organelle. In fact, there are several of these membrane-enclosed organelles. And we define organelles as simply being internal compartments that are usually specialized for specific functions. While both plants and animals are made out of eukaryotic cells, and they have several of the same organelles, there are some organelles that will only be found in one group of cells versus another. The most obvious examples of these are cell walls, chloroplasts, and central vacuoles, which are only found in plant cells. Now, an analogy that we will use to describe these different organelles of the eukaryotic cell is an extended analogy about the cell being a protein-producing factory. So again, one way to think about the eukaryotic cell is to imagine that it is a protein-producing factory, and the different organelles have different functions in this production pathway. So we're going to start this tour of our protein-producing factory in the administrative office, also known as the nucleus. Now, the reason why the nucleus is the administrative office is because this is where the genetic material is. This genetic material not only tells the cell what proteins to make, it also tells the cell when to make those proteins and how much of those proteins to make. So it sets the production schedule. The reason why it's able to do this is because it contains the DNA, the genetic material. Now, when we look at the walls of this administrative office, it's a double membrane nuclear envelope. Now, one thing that's so important to emphasize is that it's not just a phospholipid bilayer. That would be considered a single membrane. This is made up of two phospholipid bilayers, separating the internal contents of the nucleus from those other cellular components found in the cytoplasm. Now, while there are two layers of membrane separating the inside and the outside of the nucleus, there are passageways, there are pathways through this nuclear envelope known as nuclear pores. So nuclear pores, they're gateways for molecules to pass between the nucleus and the cytoplasm. What I would like to do is briefly draw an example of what this nuclear envelope looks like. So this is just sort of an accelerated or shorthand version of what these phospholipid bilayers look like. But notice here we don't just have one layer of phospholipid bilayers. There are two. So you have the cytoplasm separated from the inside of the nucleus. And then we have a series of these proteins that together make up a nuclear pore. this drawing is only two-dimensional, but imagine these proteins forming a ring-like structure, which allows certain molecules to pass from one side of the double membrane to the other. And remember, each one of these phospholipids would have their own two tails. So here we have our nuclear envelope, a double membrane structure. And this would be consistent around the entire surrounding of the nucleus. This makes up the nuclear walls. And these nuclear pores will also be located around the periphery of the nucleus. Now, the DNA within the nucleus consists of long, thin, thread-like molecules, which are loosely wrapped around a protein scaffold. When viewed under a microscope, the contents of the nucleus look like just a tangled mess. We call this diffuse collection of DNA and proteins chromatin. And we'll also see, as we go on to discuss cell division, it's this chromatin that will condense into individual visible chromosomes during cell division. Within the center of the nucleus, there's this dark central mass known as the nucleolus. So this dark spot, or dark mass, within the chromatin of the nucleus is known as the nucleolus. This is an area where ribosomal RNA is being produced. We'll discuss ribosomes and their function in much greater detail when we go on to discuss protein synthesis later in the course. As I had mentioned, this dark spot within the nucleus where the ribosomal RNA is being made is known as the nucleolus. And so when we view a diagram of the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell, there's the chromatin, this diffuse DNA internal filling, the nucleolus, which is that dark internal spot, and then a nuclear envelope perforated by nuclear pores. We'll continue with our next step of this tour in the next video when we talk about the endomembrane system.